Orex Australia has been in business since 1986, and we have around 55,000 vehicles under lease or management in Australia and New Zealand. We have offices all around the country for both AU and NZ. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Orix Group, which is a diversified financial services company listed in both the Tokyo and New York stock exchanges. We operate in 34 countries, and we have a total footprint of 1.8 million plus vehicles under lease or management within Asia Pacific. Now, when we're actually discussing APAC as a region, what we're really talking about are 5 separate regions within APAC. For example, in the East, you would be looking at China, Japan, and Korea as an example. In the Southeast, the ASEAN nations such as Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines. In the South, India and Pakistan. In the Central, you would be looking at Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and in the North, you'd be talking about Siberia. When organizations engage with Orix on what a fleet solution might look like in countries or regions in Asia Pacific, we follow a very simple approach. We make sure that we integrate, a global perspective, but integrating what the local best practices would be. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit further in terms of what the local best practices might be, because it will vary from country to country or region by region within Asia Pacific. There's an education and awareness component that you need to take into consideration. Again, something that we'll then elaborate on my next slide. From a consolidated reporting perspective, it's really about providing a robust and a secure platform that will allow you to really look at information or data across the countries and regions. And lastly, on strengthening relationships with partners, it's really about having to deal with really an organization that's got a strong reputation and track record of delivery of services within the region. Now, when we talk about, the thing on this slide about characteristics of the APAC fleet market, and if you notice what I have in terms of emerging, growth, and mature, an example of companies underneath, the definition really of what emerging, growth, and mature would be is not from an economic market perspective as it is with the availability and adoption of products and services from a fleet perspective. And from that, in that regard, emerging could be looked at as traditional products and services. Growth would be new services, and then mature would really be something that's future or forward-leaning. They're technology-centric. We're talking about mobility in that space, and then this is what we typically see more in North America and in Europe. As I've noted already in terms of the wide geographic footprint of Asia Pacific, you then have to then look at that from a government or legislation perspective in terms of what types of products and services are available. Certainly the distinctiveness of the region within Asia Pacific, the language and culture has to be a factor in consideration. The availability of manufacturers and products in the market, the currency inflation, of course, and the economic conditions within those areas. When we talk about traditional services, we look at what we would associate in terms of fleet in general, and that would be a corporate fleet that would then be potentially augmented by a rental fleet, that you're dealing with a fleet manager. You're looking at typical financing products, whether it's finance or operating leases. The type of services are basic, such as maintenance, roadside assistance, very, very conventional, very traditional. But when you look at the new services, it really is about the emerging markets. That's when you start leaning in towards the technology space, where you add things such as telematics, hybrid vehicles. We're now starting to look at consolidated platforms in having access to analytics, having a pool booking or ride sharing. And this is where, again, with the big data also the aggregation of big data to allow you to do analytics. And then lastly, on the future, which is the forward-leaning components, it's really what we typically see, as I said, in North America and Europe, and that's where you look at the shared solutions, subscription services. You're looking at autonomous driving. You've got mobility considerations, and artificial intelligence as well. Now, from an overcoming of challenges, given the challenges associated with managing a fleet across the region, how do you actually overcome them? The first thing that we would provide as an advice is really about finding an established APAC fleet partner that really has a footprint, a wide footprint in the region, that has a solid reputation in terms of being able to provide services. There's a lot of time that needs to be invested in regards to understanding these the local markets that an established fleet partner should be able to give, and that's really what's available in terms of services. It could be that you may have a country that may have operating leases, but that's not necessarily something that you might expect in another country, just because they're not really in a position to provide the maintenance component, in that regard. So it's really about understanding the local practices and what's available in those. The other component is, what are the local customs and preferred solutions in those markets? How do people actually get from point A to point B in terms of goods and services? And what are the alternatives associated with that? Is it a typical, wheels car, or are we talking public transport? What are the local customs and solutions? And then the component is really about, realigning the perspective in terms of making sure that the local outcomes are gained, but it fits in terms of what the overall regional goals that you may have in the space. Now, in terms of making APAC one region, the things here that's really critical, it's really about, the first component of this is really about having a consolidated platform in terms of reporting. As I've kind of noted, the ability to aggregate data and then be able to put a layer on top of that allows you to be able to make decisions, providing analytics to make decisions is very critical. And the second component of that is really having localized accountability in those areas, and then having a clear escalation pathway. If items are not resolved at the local level, how do you actually escalate to make sure that if issues arise, people understand at the local level how that needs to be managed upward. What are the tips that that needs to be considered? I think I mentioned already, establishing or aligning yourself with an established fleet partner, having partnerships that with an organization that's got deep regional knowledge, that understands how to cater for local and regional needs, the ability to aggregate up those services and the data to make sure that you can actually report on those. Managing expectations cannot be stressed highly enough, in large part just because there are limitations in local markets. Not all countries in Asia Pacific would have the same types of product services. And then investing in reporting that can be stretched locally and regionally. And that's really the presentation that I put together. I was really making kind of questions that people might have in regards to Asia Pacific.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you, Reggie. I hope you can hear me again.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the presentation. To the audience, if you have questions, please use the chat function. Ask your question to Reggie. He is really the expert on vehicle fleet management across APAC. He is also the expert, of course, of his own organization, Orix. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat function and I will moderate them. Reggie, of course, I prepared some questions myself. You can imagine. You talked about making APAC one region. Now, most of the fleet managers will have challenges to make it one region. You gave some tips, but do you really think that it's possible for a global fleet manager to deal with APAC as one region? Or will there always be like sub-regional identities that you take into consideration?
I think to address that component, Stephen, you have to look at it from two perspectives. One is from a reporting perspective, and that's really about data aggregation that allows then the flow of information to be captured and aggregated up. And then so from a global fleet manager perspective, it's really getting insight in terms of the local practices or local, it's about getting access to the local information to make smart decisions. Now, that's one component. The other component of that is really about the availability of what products and what type of services with local markets. As I said previously in the presentation, some markets just do not have the availability to be able to provide a specific product or services. There may be restrictions on that from a regulatory perspective. So it's a yes and no in terms of looking at APAC as a one region. Now, in terms of those tips that I noted, and I think it's worth repeating again, I think the component of consolidated reporting is critical because that allows for decision making. From our perspective, it's having one, a very secure platform. Two, it's feature rich in terms of that reporting platform. It's robust. And I think that's important. The second component of that would be, having localized accountability in the country in terms of if something happens, how can it be resolved immediately? Mm-hmm. And then the second that, of course, is the escalation, making sure there's clear pathway from that perspective.
Okay. Perhaps it's good that you share your presentation again, because there is a question about the geographic footprint of Orix. And so perhaps by answering those questions, you can also perhaps use the presentation. In the meantime, perhaps an intermediate question for the time that you launch again the presentation is, do you think that there are countries in APAC where perhaps the maturity curve that we see in North America and in Europe, going from your first, let's say, income, the possibility to buy a car, then perhaps that you can lease a car, then that your company is going to give you a car, and so on and so on. Do you think that in some countries in APAC, perhaps that traditional curve that we see in Europe and North America can be broken, and that, for example, people will immediately move to new mobility modes?
I think, potentially what can happen, Stephen, is that, in that evolutionary process, it could be that some things are jumped over. Singapore is a great example. There's limitations in terms of number of vehicles, for example, you can have in the country. And so from a mobility perspective, it's really about, well, how do we actually address, the transport of goods and services given those limitations, or people? Is it a matter of having a mobility card that allows people to use different types of transport? It's really about providing flexibility. And I do think that for some countries in Asia Pacific, I think that some of those evolutionary steps that we're seeing in North America or Europe, potentially that gets jumped over, and the adoption of some of the more advanced ones would be more apparent.
Okay. Let's now come back to the footprint. Can you once again mention in how many countries you are present in APAC?
Sure. Yeah. So Orix Group currently operates in, not just Asia Pacific, but globally. We operate in 34 countries or regions. And in Asia Pacific alone, we have about 1.8 million vehicles under management.
Okay. The question, first one is from Ivor Johnson, and there's a follow-up question from Shula Sulagezion, sorry for the pronunciation. It's a little bit in the same atmosphere. I see. The Ivor Johnson of Pfizer asks, can you please expand on Orix footprint in APAC? So I don't know if, for example, you can mention perhaps the countries where you are really, where you have a strong footprint and where you are, let's say, emerging. And secondly, do you partner with other fleet management companies to provide a fuller coverage than you already have today on your own?
Okay. Sure. In terms of, I may not have a full list for you of specific of all the countries in Asia Pacific, but I can start in terms of areas where we've got good presence. I'll start, of course, with Japan, where our global headquarters is, Australia, New Zealand, India, Singapore, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan. We also have presence. Just top of mind for me. I think I mentioned India already, but that's really where I'm going to leave that, because if there are specific other areas I'm missing, it could be that we have presence in the area, but we may not necessarily offer fleet as a solution.
Okay. Okay.
In terms of partnerships, in Asia Pacific, no, we would not have a partner in Asia Pacific. However, Orix is part of the Global Fleet Alliance, which really gets us global coverage through our partners ARI in North America and Europe, and with Equestra in South and East Africa.
Okay, good. Then the question from Shula Sulagezion: will Orix be an APAC regional partner and leasing fleet management company? And there is also a question, could you explain what your activities really are? For example, is it leasing? Is it fleet management? Is it also a service, maintenance, repair? How broad is it when we look at the fleet management picture?
Yeah. So the response to that question, Stephen, would be really aligned in terms of the maturity of the market. But otherwise, we do provide a full fleet solution. If it's an operating lease, that will have components in terms of maintenance, repairs. It even has vehicle replacement if required. So the whole gamut in terms of fleet management. But that is predicated in terms of what products and services are available within the country. As I've noted in my presentation, in terms of some countries are emerging, some are growth, some are mature. That really points towards what available products and services are in those markets.
Okay. What activities do you do to increase or maximize the residual value of the vehicles? Do you use, for example, partnerships there? Are you doing cross-border sales, etc., to be able, let's say, to maximize residual values for customers?
No, we don't do cross-border. What we do as a general practice is we really rely on both a local and more local than it is international in terms of residual values that we look at. In large part, the secondary market in local markets is really what does those for us. We do look at what trends might be for specific models globally. And then we try and baseline that against what's happening in a localized market. Something that might be really popular, for example, in the Philippines may not necessarily be something that's, that has the same type of attraction in Australia or in Japan for that matter. So.
Okay. A question from Robert Patrick from JSK. Regional fleet management companies and lease companies give us the strategic model but global fleet managers want, however, at the same time, also that you are competitive, and competitive also on a local level. So how can you ensure that at the same time you have that strategic regional approach and guaranteeing for your customers that you can satisfy them also locally against the prices, the services of the local heroes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's something that always is visited when organizations approach us in terms of solutions. The thing I will say to that is, I mentioned earlier about education and awareness. So it really starts there for us, and what I mean by that is the first component is really understanding, what's available. And then from that perspective, you aggregate up. And there's elements of that potentially, and what I mean by aggregate up is you may end up at the localized markets really just having very limited types of products and services. But then you might be able to layer that, in terms of from a reporting perspective, in terms of the intelligence, the data aggregation that you're actually using, so that you're in a better position to really understand, for that particular localized product and service, this is really what it's costing you, or this is the frequency that it's happening. And then from that perspective, you're then able to make other decisions in terms of, well, maybe in the future, we don't necessarily set it up that way, because this information that we're now having access to can actually guide us into a better alternative. I hope that kind of makes sense. I mean, there's a localized component, but it's how that information can be aggregated up so that you can then make decisions on a strategic level that will then fall back down in terms of, well, maybe in the next iteration, in terms of how we provide a fleet solution, or the next cycle, it now has to be varied, because this is what we're seeing, in terms of what is traditionally, or how it's traditionally being used.
Okay. In some countries in APAC, legislation and taxation can change overnight. What is your recommendation to international fleet managers that have, let's say, global guidelines, have developed a strategy, are implementing decisions that they have taken, and they are faced, let's say, in countries, not only in APAC, but also in APAC, with legislation and taxation that is changed overnight?
That's really having a partner that really overlooks that or oversees that. I mean, the countries that we operate in from a fleet perspective in Asia Pacific, that's something that we keep a close eye on. So having a partner that actually looks at that, and then being able to then pass on that information, that happens on a regular basis with us in the countries that we operate and have presence in. That's just a given. So.
Okay. If I am a fleet manager getting the responsibility over APAC, having, let's say, a diversified fleet across different countries in APAC, some of them looking at the slide that you have put on the screen, some of them in the mature markets, some of them in the growth markets, and some of them in the emerging markets, what would you recommend to me? That I start with the mature markets, that I start with the emerging markets, so the challenging one, let's say, that I try to do a mix, that I look at where I have the most people and the most vehicles? What is a little bit your guideline in implementing a strategy across APAC?
Yeah, no, the starting point really is about understanding what the organizational goal is. And so when organizations can engage with us, it's really about understanding, well, what are you after? Are you after a solution that allows you, one point of contact, not dealing with many vendors in the space? Are you requiring a uniform set of products and services? Are you looking at technology-centric, components such as reporting, analytics? Really, it's about understanding first what the organization is after. In our experience, it's often a combination of those things, but there are priorities that's been set. And so it's really understanding about those priorities and then being able to then say, okay, well, if this is the #1 priority that you have, we can address that in these countries because we're in a position and those products and services, all of those are available. Those would be something that would be easy. And for the things that are less on, in terms of the order of priority, there may be things that are not just as important. And it could be those are things that gets, you tackle in a phase 2 or a phase 3.
Okay, very good. Another question is linked to the activities of Orix. When we talk about fleet management and vehicle leasing, are you focusing on vehicles, or are you also, for example, doing business with two-wheel mobility, shared mobility, and so on?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes, and that's done at the local level, local country level. So in Japan, for example, we have one of the largest car sharing platforms in the country. In Australia and New Zealand, we, for example, we will be providing subscription type services. We're also providing pay-as-you-go. In India, we already do a subscription service as well. So it's really very much at a localized level. And that's really in response to demand in those local markets. It's not our habit to come up with something and push it out in across the region if there's not a demand for it. It's often at the local level where those initiatives are started and developed to cater for local demands.
Okay. A final question from my side. If the audience still has questions, please put it in the chat function because we need to end the breakout with Reggie and Orix in a few minutes. One of the topics also important in APAC, of course, is everything that is related to safety. What is your main tip for fleet managers that need to increase the safety within their vehicle fleet across APAC? Is there something based on your experiences that you say, well, this is probably the one thing that you should do?
Yeah, no. Again, another good question, Stephen. Education, education, education. At the end of the day, it's really about how information is flowed, all the way out to the driver level. And that can't be stressed out. And it has to be platforms that can be consumed, through different channels. At the end of the day, it's really about having access to information. That's really what the reinforcement is, from a safety perspective. Now, the other component of that, of course, is, adopting technology, especially for countries that are in that growth or mature stage. Technology such as, telematics, that kind of gives you the monitoring that might be required. But that's really just reinforcement. The starting point is really about education. And that's really about having platforms that can push the information out.
Okay. Reggie, thank you very much. We need to end the breakout session here. Thank you for your presence. Thank you also for your thoughts and your insights.